This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Sanich. Our guest this episode, Graeme Scarfe, author of Peter Gabriel, Every Album, Every Song. If Genesis, according to British comedian and fan Al Murray, were the progressive rock band who progressed, then Peter Gabriel, once solo, would be the one who progressed the most. Who would have thought listening to early Genesis would eventually take the listener to Senegal, Armenia, South Africa, and beyond via the artistic endeavors of their former vocalist? During his 40-year-plus solo career, Gabriel has become a worldwide pop star with his early self-titled albums and his seminal 1986 record, So. He's had hit singles throughout his career, including Big Time and the poignant In Your Eyes. He also helped pioneer video creativity with the song Sledgehammer. In doing so, he's reached beyond his progressive rock background to achieve a level of respect that other musicians from that genre could only dream about. You may have heard many of these songs before, but there's always something new to be found by digging in the dirt. Peter Gabriel, Every Album, Every Song is the perfect guide to his music for new listeners and long-term fans alike. Graeme Scarfe is a freelance writer. He was born in the 1960s, educated in the comprehensive system in the 1970s and 1980s, and graduated from Bournemouth University in the 1990s. He's worked as a music journalist, sound recordist, stand-up comedian, and film and media lecturer. He wrote the original screenplay for the 1999 British horror film Lighthouse, and the comedy novels Arable Farm and Seagulls on Speed. Graeme is married with 2 children and lives in Sussex. To hear a playlist of the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Graeme, thank you for being on the podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
In your introduction, you write that Peter Gabriel appealed and unnerved you. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, up to that point, I've been a fan of Elvis Presley, really, and pretty much exclusively. So hearing a voice like Gabriel's, and we're talking sort of 1980, 81, which was so unlike Presley's, with those strange cadences and distinctive vocal approach, I just felt that the whole voice encapsulated something quite beautiful, but at the same time quite sinister, which is a sort of an attraction and a repulsion at the same time. It gives real drama to the songs.
After leaving Genesis in 1974, Peter didn't rush right into a solo career. He instead took the John Lennon approach and decided to live the everyman's everyday life. As he said, he focused on growing cabbages and children. Was he being literal, or was there more to it? I've read that he was taking piano and music lessons during this time.
Yeah, I suppose you could see it as him sort of completing his musical education to an extent, so he wouldn't necessarily be dependent on the other members of a band. And at the same time, he was enjoying that space that leaving the band gave him. I imagine that could have been quite suffocating anyway. There's 5 in the band, remember. And Phil Collins says something similar when he left Genesis in 92, that ability to breathe within his career. So there is that element of just stepping away from it and helping his wife and daughter and growing cabbages. But he wasn't completely away from it. I mean, he did do some bits and pieces. He recorded a song for what was actually quite a misguided film. It's called All This in World War II, which is a neat title, but a not very neat film, which has it's a quasi-documentary with images of the Second World War, accompanied by music of the Beatles, but recorded by contemporary artists at the time. And Gabriel was asked to record Strawberry Fields Forever. So that's his first sort of solo outing, if you like. And he also co-wrote and produced a single by an English entertainer by the name of Charlie Drake, who was sort of a baby-faced, baby-voiced music hall comedian, or what the equivalent of vaudeville, I suppose. And that was called You Never Know. And that's very sort of twee and quirky elements of, I suppose, I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe. And that sort of the Britishness or the Englishness of it. And it's not a fantastic song, but that's his first foray into producing as well. So if he was doing anything, he was turning his back on the monster machinery of the industry rather than the industry itself, I suppose.
He eventually gets back to work and releases his debut album. I'll note, as you do in the book, that the first 4 Peter Gabriel albums all simply carried Peter's name only, but since have earned alternative nicknames. Throughout the interview, we will do as you did in the book and use those names as well. The first album, released in February of 1977, is known as Car. It has that beautifully shot black and white picture of Peter in a car with raindrops on it. The car was owned by legendary artist Storm Thorgerson, who designed the cover. He's famous for the Pink Floyd covers. The album opens with a song that sounds much like one he'd record with Genesis, Moribund the Burgermeister. Perhaps Peter giving fans a similar sound to ease them into his experimental solo career?
I think that's a reasonable assumption. If you come from a successful band like Genesis were at the time, then an artist moving forwards into a solo career must understand that he has a particular following, and you wouldn't want to do something completely contrasting that would deter that potential following. So they need something, I suppose, a little bit familiar, and that's what you got with Moribund the Burgermeister. It's very easy to fit into a Genesis album of that period. So those fans coming to Car, as it's known, they wouldn't have found something that they weren't familiar with or comfortable with. So I think that's quite a canny move on Gabriel's part.
Track 2 is Peter's debut single, Salisbury Hill, top 20 in the UK, number 68 in the US. The message of the song is, according to Peter, about being prepared to lose what you have for what you might get. It's about letting go?
Absolutely. I mean, that's partly why the approach to the song, I think, is very light, very poppy, especially after that sort of heavy intensity of the Genesis writing sessions. And we know from record that there were great battles between various members of the band to get their material onto the albums. One of the reasons why, a few years later, Steve Hackett leaves. And it can't have been easy for Gabriel. I mean, not just that dynamic, but the fact that he was torn between William Friedkin's offer to write or co-write a film script or a film scenario, and then dealing with the difficult birth of his first daughter, and the fact that the band were just on that precipice of breaking through into the US. So, if there's a message in that song at all, it's just that things are just too heavy not to let them go. And there's a space within the song that I think vindicates its sort of high chart singles placing. I mean, higher than any single that Genesis had released up to that point.
Legendary producer Bob Ezrin produced this album. Ezrin, famous for his work with Alice Cooper and Kiss, among many others. He wanted Peter to change the final line in this song. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, the final line of the lyric was, make your life a taxi, not a tomb, which is something of a downer, to be fair. And I think Ezrin just wanted something a little bit more uplifting, perhaps. So instead we get the lyric, grab your things, I've come to take you home, which is much more optimistic. And of course, there's that sort of religious undertone that people have since seen in the song.
I think it was a good call. It's got a nice feeling to it, and it's a lyric that definitely stands out.
Yeah, it's very, I mean, as an end point, it's taking you up and further on, isn't it? It's very positive.
Peter's second album comes out June 1978, now known as Scratch. This cover features Peter clawing away at the picture, somewhat sinister looking. He wasn't happy with Bob Ezrin's production on the first album. He brings in ex-King Crimson guitarist Robert Fripp to produce. Also on this album is Roy Bittan of Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band. What was it that he didn't like about Ezrin's production?
I think he thought that it was overproduced. And if you look at Scratch, you can hear that sort of pared-down sound, very much in keeping with the British New Wave at the time. And I'd argue that if he'd done this as his solo debut, I think that his career might well have followed a similar route to that of, say, Peter Hamill. Lots of experimentation, but very low on sales. And that first album is a very sort of gentle easing in. You've got lots of different styles, that lovely barbershop quartet on Excuse Me, for example, Salisbury Hill and Humdrum, and Here Comes the Flood. But this second one really takes you by the throat, and in essence, it's a punk album, I think, really. And this wouldn't be the first time that successive albums would sound different from their predecessor. I mean, interestingly, you've got that second album is often described by people as their least favourite of his early work. Very abrasive, very sharp in places. And to be honest, when it came to write the book, of all the albums, that was the one that I wasn't sort of looking forward to spending any time with.
Really?
Only because it just feels a very sort of a black and white, cold album to me. I mean, that view did change, and there's White Shadow is beautiful, and Indigo is lovely. But overall, abrasive quality of the album, I think it's just replicated in that scratchy cover as well. Very much a case if you can judge a book by its cover in that instance.
DIY comes off of this album, an acronym for do it yourself, something in the ethos of UK culture at the time. You feel Peter may have been trying to capitalize off of the success of Salisbury Hill on this song?
It's a very direct song. I think he was, if he was trying to capitalize on the success of Salisbury Hill, I'm not sure that DIY did that particularly successfully. I think there are far more better and more obvious choices of a single from that album, perhaps Animal Magic or Wonderful Day in a One-Way World. I think they're better. But then if you look at the charts at the time and the types of songs and the artists that were dominating that period, it actually does fit in very well. I mean, ironically, of course, it didn't do very well in the charts itself.
Late May of 1980, we get the album known as Melt, Peter's first UK #1 album. New sounds, new ways of making music. That's basically the theme of this album.
Yeah, I think it's becoming clear by 1980, and we're sort of 2 albums in, this is the 3rd, that Gabriel is never going to be one to follow the herd, so to speak. So this is very much, I'd argue, it's very much his first experimental album in the way that things were recorded, definitely. Like recording smashing glass or banging bits of concrete together, which gives that whole album a sort of an industrial feel. And then you've got the producer, you've got Steve Lillywhite, who is very modern producer, more so than Ezrin or Fripp, who came to the album with their own sort of prog credentials, if you like. And you've got Steve Lillywhite and his team, which remember includes Hugh Padgham. And they've worked with people like XTC or The Jam, for example. So Gabriel's really on board with this sort of new, youthful approach, perhaps. And you only have to listen back to it to realise how different it is from scratch, and actually how much of a better record it is from scratch.
Speaking of new sounds, Peter brings in his former bandmate Phil Collins to play drums, and this album is very significant, especially in terms of Phil's career. It's on the lead track, Intruder, that we get the classic Phil Collins drum sound. And if you love the In the Air Tonight sound, this is where it all starts. Can you tell the story?
Yeah, Phil Collins is just playing around with drum patterns on an unfinished song, which was called Margarita. And they're working with the solid-state Logic mixing desk. And the gate compressor within that actually simultaneously shuts off and squashes the sound. So the reverb is limited to an extent. So you get a sort of echo within the moment, I suppose. And it makes a much bigger sound and certainly came to define the 1980s. And it's all over the 80s. Power stations, Some Like It Hot, Kate Bush's, Hounds of Love, Springsteen's Born in the USA. And there's internet that Gabriel had insisted on having no metal on the album. So where the cymbals and the hi-hat should be, they had to hang drums from the ceiling because of that sort of instinctively as a drummer. Phil Collins might just go to hit a cymbal and if there's nothing there, it sort of stops the flow, perhaps. And I think that lack of metal and sort of extra drums, if you like, gives it that heavy sound. So there's no cymbal crash to break things up. And of course, Padgham, I suppose he's the engineer or the producer of the 80s sound, isn't he? Because he worked on Face Value, Phil Collins' first solo album, and then you've got the 2 Genesis albums, what's known as Shapes and Invisible Touch, plus Hello, I Must Be Going, No Jacket Required, and But Seriously. And they're all, all big, massive hits, those albums. Padgham's doing something right, isn't he?
He sure is. And the song Intruder, you're a fan of. You write that it's a ballsy opening to the album.
Yeah, I like this track much more than either, say, Moribund, The Burgermeister, or On the Air, which are the 2 tracks that open the previous 2 albums. I mean, it really does encapsulate the idea of somebody breaking in and defiling your property. A very powerful piece, not least, of course, by that gated drum sound. I mean, as the 80s proceeded, everybody wanted a piece of that sound. But it's just, here is where it is, and it's very dark, very sinister.
I think it's only because that song wasn't a hit single that people didn't realize that that's where that Phil Collins drum sound began.
Yeah, everybody talks about In the Air Tonight. I mean, and rightly so, that's where it sort of hits pay dirt. But yeah, right here is where it starts.
Side 2 kicks off with one of Peter's biggest solo singles, Games Without Frontiers, his first UK top 10, number 48 in the US. This is Peter infusing political lyrics with pop sensibility. Peter uses a popular game show of that time to highlight just how silly war is. The game show was called It's a Knockout, which was itself inspired by a European show called Games Without Borders.
Yeah, and that's a very simple concept. Instead of resolving global conflicts with a very human cost in lives, you just get world leaders around a table, or in this case, sort of in a game show scenario. And of course, it was initially the Games Without Borders was an idea initiated by General Charles de Gaulle in France to positively promote entente cordiale between the youth of Europe that had been so scarred and damaged in the Second World War. I mean, it's a great message within the song, but wrapped up very neatly with a rather engaging melody and that very effective repeated chorus line. I remember this distinctly being released as a single and just feeling that freshness of it. It's so different from songs at the time. I spoke about how similar Scratch was to the singles and the artists around 1980, but I spoke before about how similar Scratch was to the singles and artists at the time in 1978. But it's 1980 now, and Gabriel's really feeling his way forward, setting his own pace, forging his own path, and that's down to all those sort of experimental techniques I spoke about before. And of course, you've got Kate Bush on backing vocals, rather sort of sensual, je sans frontière, just sort of lightly in the background. There's a lightness of touch that comes across the whole song, and it's the art of any good single, and it does bear repeated listening, and that's reflected in the chart placing at the time.
Meanwhile, by this time, and it would continue in the future, Peter Gabriel is getting great reviews across the board. He really was the critics' darling.
More critics' darling than maybe commercial. I mean, as a mainstream artist, and that doesn't come until a couple of albums down the line.
Yeah, which we'll get to. It's also on this album where we see the direction Peter would go with the song Biko. This also features Phil Collins. It's about the murder of Bantu Steve Biko, a South African anti-apartheid activist. This turned out to be an important song for Peter Gabriel, and a controversial one. It was banned in South Africa, right?
Yes, it was. Not the first song to highlight the problems of apartheid in South Africa through the song, but with the ordeal and the death of Steve Biko, and I suppose given Gabriel's profile, it is the one that most people remember, and it does seem to have kick-started the whole wave of anti-apartheid awareness that sort of runs through the 1980s. And I suppose ultimately that leads to the release of Nelson Mandela from Robben Island in 1989, doesn't it? 1990. A moving part of the live shows as well, and it remains so. Right at the end, as a crowd are repeating Biko, 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 Gabriel often holds his fist up aloft and says, "The rest is up to you."
In September of 1982, Peter releases album number 4, known as Security, the first of 3 albums to be recorded at his home in Bath. Would you say this album is an extension of the song Biko?
I'm not sure it's an extension, but it's certainly an extension of the process, that experimental process that he was beginning to weave into his music. And of course, you've got Paul Simon does something very similar with the Graceland and Rhythm of the Saints albums. But where Simon ran into lots of problems and a lot of trouble during the Graceland project, and I remember having to cross picket lines just to see the concerts in 1987, Gabriel doesn't approach the sound from other cultures. What he does is he learns from them. And there's a subtle difference that he's not playing a sort of a post-colonial card, if you like. I'm not saying that Paul Simon himself did, but I think that's how it was perceived at the time. White man coming in and appropriating black music and passing it off as his own.
Critics connected this album to the style of Talking Heads, particularly with a song like I Have the Touch. Sounds Magazine described it as a song close to the Talking Heads style of sheer markability in funk.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I Have the Touch is a very alive song, isn't it? At the same time, you can hear sort of a Talking Heads feel to it. I mean, they're certainly moving in the right directions. It doesn't surprise me, really, but when you have somebody like David Byrne in the Talking Heads who has that same restless, creative mind and energy towards music as Gabriel does. And, of course, the two did overlap years later on the Scratch My Back project when Gabriel recorded Talking Heads' Listening Wind and David Byrne records a rather fine cover of I Don't Remember.
Although I Have the Touch did well as a single, it was Shock the Monkey that was the biggest hit from this album. It reached number 29 in the U.S., 58 in the U.K., and the rhythms generated from a variety of contrasting noises.
Yeah, it's a brave choice as a single, that one. I remember hearing Shock the Monkey when it first came out and not quite sure how to marry up that sound with the sounds I'd heard on previous albums. But that is ultimately the joy of Peter Gabriel, I suppose, is not knowing where the next album will go. And you only have to look at So and Us or So and Security to see that the one doesn't follow the other.
The lyrics often misinterpreted as being about electric shock therapy, but that isn't the case. What is Shock the Monkey really about?
No, I mean, that's a common misconception, isn't it? And the video doesn't really help to dispel that anyway. It's actually a satire on sexual jealousy and how such jealousies make monkeys of us all. And there's an agricultural term in England for coupling or sex, which is cover me, which of course is the term that Gabriel uses throughout. And there's a clever use of puns as well, rat on the rat, fox on the fox, etc., which Gabriel has always been fond of, even going as far back as his Genesis days.
Now, this is when I remember first seeing Peter Gabriel a lot on MTV. He's one of the artists who embraced the music video as opposed to some of his peers who reluctantly made them, only because their label told them they had to, which is understandable because you get a video on MTV, that's going to sell lots of albums. But for Peter, he saw this as another form of art.
Yeah, you only have to look back at Gabriel's time with Genesis, when initially they're just this sort of run-of-the-mill prog band, like others at the time, for example, Van de Graaff Generator, until the moment that he dons the fox's head and puts on his wife's red dress. And then thereafter, boom, Genesis go to number 11. They're on a completely different level as a very visual, theatrical band. And I suppose the music video is an extension of that, especially Gabriel's music videos. Remember, we're talking sort of 1982. Music videos were in that sort of first flush of popularity and creativity. Shock the Monkey isn't a great music video and not particularly memorable, but it does show Gabriel moving more towards the form of visual expression.
Yeah, and it definitely introduced him to a whole new generation of fans, including myself. After releasing his first soundtrack album with Birdie in 1985, Peter returns in 1986 with the biggest album of his career, So. His fifth studio album. It was nominated for a Grammy, number 1 in the UK, number 2 in the US. It's appeared on many greatest album lists since. Peter wasn't surprised by this. He said he wanted to write proper pop songs, albeit in my own terms. And boy, did he ever write some great pop songs. Is this Peter's best album?
Well, in commercial terms, So is absolutely his best album and his most successful album. Not only is he writing pop songs on his own terms, he's reaching a much wider audience. And up to that point, as you alluded to earlier on, he was something of a cult artist. The critics loved him, audiences not quite sure perhaps who he was or what sort of music genre he was working in. So with Melt and Security, that's not mainstream at all. But suddenly, and I mentioned this in the book, he's having that moment in the pop sunshine. Everybody knows who Peter Gabriel is. The music is suddenly much more instantly accessible. Sledgehammer has him replicating that Otis Redding sound, which he loves so much. And the music video for Sledgehammer actually did break through into the mainstream. And remember all the awards that in itself picked up. And he wasn't alone in that breakthrough, of course. I mean, Genesis released Invisible Touch at the same time, and they reached their moment in the pop sunshine. So definitely that time when those artists are reaching their zenith, really. I've got a cross trainer at home because I basically loathe physical exercise. I won't go to the gym. I'm not going to embarrass myself by running around the lanes of the villages around here.
Yeah.
But I often get on the cross trainer, and when I do, that's the album I put on. I guess this is Peter Gabriel's gym album. To think Jane Fonda made a mint out of her workout albums, Gabriel could have had a second career, couldn't he?
Yeah, he could have. I went on many a car ride back in high school when this album came out. It is a classic from start to finish. Starts with Red Rain, brilliant track. Track 2 is the number 1 single, Sledgehammer. Almost did make the album, surprisingly. Amidst the hairband era with MTV and radio overflowing with songs about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, here comes Peter's song filled with sexual innuendo. But it's also driven by 60s soul music, as you said, and traditional blues songs.
Yeah, it's a driving, sort of pulsating song, and the aim of it really was to create that style of the 1960s soul music that so excited Peter Gabriel when he was at Charterhouse School, and he started to become aware of Stax Records singers like Otis Redding, and I think legend has it that he bunked off school one evening and got up to the Ram Jam Club in Brixton in London, because Charterhouse isn't that far from London, to see Otis Redding and his 14-piece all-American band, which featured Wayne Jackson, who then worked with Gabriel on Sledgehammer as part of the Memphis Horns. So you've really got that authenticity that Gabriel was seeking for that 60s soul music.
And the title Sledgehammer comes from the work ethic and the approach to the music Peter and producer Daniel Lanois had. I believe they wear the construction hats in the video as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they Lanois and Gabriel, and I think David Rhodes is present at that point as well, all used to wear high-vis jackets, hard hats in the early stages of writing that album. And just that idea of, we'll use that sort of sledgehammer idea to break things up or break through to another particular sound. Just getting down to it, getting your hands dirty and making something.
I remember reading somewhere too that I think it was during this album that he hid himself away in a cabin somewhere in the middle of the woods and stayed there until he came out with lyrics to one of the songs. I think it was on this album.
Yeah, I've heard that. I can't off the top of my head remember what the song is, but yeah, quite extreme attempts to get something down. Yeah.
Don't Give Up, That Voice Again make up the rest of side 1. Side 2 opens with In Your Eyes, a number 1 mainstream rock track, 26 on the Hot 100. The original title was Sagrada. What was Sagrada?
Yeah, well, the Sagrada Familia is a large, unfinished Roman Catholic church in Barcelona in Spain, designed by Spanish architect Antoni Gaudi. And you can find the song itself, the original Sagrada track. It's on the So DNA CD as part of the special edition box set for So. And that itself does offer an insight into how the song evolved. And Sagrada itself is basically the vocal melody from In Your Eyes. And Gabriel just couldn't get it to a point that he wanted it to be. But he liked certain parts of it. So then take one part that was going well and maybe supplant it into another track, and of course that becomes In Your Eyes. But if you look at the So DNA release, it's a fascinating way that they've done it. They've got the album songs in the running order of the album itself, but they've taken different demo versions. So you get an album starts off particularly roughly, perhaps maybe just him and a piano extemporizing with some sort of nonsense lyrics, and then it's mixed into a different later demo, and so on and so forth. So what you actually get with all these songs is the song, you're listening to the songs evolving as you're listening to them. It's fascinating.
And I believe that Peter had some pushback when it came to where that track was going to be. I think he wanted it to be on side 1, but it ended up on side 2.
Yeah, he wanted it, I think it was, at the end of the first side. But the way that the pressing technique would mean that the bass sound wouldn't be as strong where it was. Certainly when they've repressed it, recently Real World has released vinyl versions in what you could say would be the original and intended running order, just because the way that it's pressed now gives the bass the meat it wanted, but he couldn't do that at the time in '86.
Mercy Street, the next track, that's followed by another huge single, Big Time, number 8 in the U.S. Peter mocking himself as a pop star, but also poking fun at Margaret Thatcher and the materialist consumerism culture of the UK at the time.
Yeah, it's a very fun song, Big Time. But at the same time, it's also looking at that materialism and casting that cautionary eye over the greed culture that was prevailing at the time in the UK. And the more serious investigation of the effect of so-called Thatcherism was having on the country, and I'm talking about the UK, is Don't Give Up, of course, which features a character there who's lost his job, lost his sense of identity, which was true of many people at the time, especially during the miners' strike of 1984, where unemployment rose, communities effectively destroyed by the government and their policies. Big Time, by contrast, is just very upbeat. It's fun. It has a massive, great smile on its face from the word go. It's fantastic.
A standout aspect of the Peter Gabriel sound was the bass. Tony Levin, who is actually from not too far where I am here in Connecticut. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts. He plays a significant role in Peter's music. If you could talk about Tony Levin's importance to Peter Gabriel.
I think for any band that stays together for any lengthy period of time, those artists will support each other and feed each other creatively. I think for a solo artist, that must be particularly difficult. So I suppose to work repeatedly with a particular person with whom you have a creative or musical affinity with is very important. So you've got Tony Levin's input into what I suppose we should call the Peter Gabriel sound, along with guitarist David Rhodes as well. It's very important, and they crop up on pretty much all of his albums. So they're all on that creative exploratory journey together. And it's interesting to think just how different that would be with, dare I say it, a more straightforward bass player, perhaps, other than Tony Levin, because Tony Levin isn't just the bass player. It's what he adds to the creative input, which I suppose Gabriel, being such an experimentalist, he really responds to that. There's no limit that you say, well, I can't do that. Tony Levin's the sort of person that says, well, I will do that. If I want to dull the sound down on the bass, I think it was Don't Give Up, he puts a diaper between the strings and the guitar itself just to deaden the sound of it. And that's, I can imagine the smile on Gabriel's face when he walked into the studio with that.
Yeah, I can imagine. I did read that. He used a diaper under the strings at the bridge to mute the sound. By the time So ends its run, Peter's a huge pop star thanks to heavy radio airplay and even bigger MTV exposure. 3 years after So, he releases another soundtrack. This time it's 1989's Passion, later re-released as Passion, Music for the Last Temptation of Christ. He wins Grammy for Best New Age Album. A Greatest Hits collection follows in 1990. Then he returns with his sixth studio album, Us. And as you note in the book, it's a long time between studio albums, 6 years. The album was a success, #2 in the US and UK, but could it have been even bigger if it were released sooner?
There's no question, I think, that if he'd have been of a mind to capitalise on the success of So, I think he could have done so very easily with a very quick follow-up in the same style. But that's not Gabriel at all. And as you said, we had Passion, the music of the Last Temptation of Christ, which in itself is an incredible piece of work. First time that Gabriel is in the producer's chair on his own. Most successful album of world music in commercial terms. And also because he was setting up the Real World record label as well. So, his time was taken on other things. And of course, Gabriel being Gabriel, he's going to take time to find his next direction for a studio release. So yeah, 6 years is a long time, but he's not going to just put things out for the sake of it. And we had the Shaking the Tree best of compilation work, which sort of fulfilled a record company desire for more material in the marketplace, I suppose. But ultimately, I suppose Gabriel is a music cultivator. And as with all things that are cultivated, they take time. The culmination of those musical experiments finally makes its way out into the world in 1982, and not a second before.
Steam, a top 40 single in the US, #10 in the UK. It has that Sledgehammer feel to it. In fact, you called it the son of Sledgehammer. And you also feel it's out of place on this album.
Yeah, ironically, this almost contradicts what I just said about Gabriel not wanting to replicate. But Steam certainly does feel like Sledgehammer Part 2, not least because it includes a number of sexual innuendos. Sledgehammer did, uses the Memphis horn section again. So those similarities are there, and perhaps that was part of the hook, and it did rather well in the charts as well. But Us is a good album, but it's not a monster album like So. And you'd be a fool to think that lightning can strike in the same place twice, when it almost did, but just not quite.
Digging in the dirt, here Peter is, as you write, exploring his emotional relationship with a woman, only this time it's not one of romantic attachment, but of blood. Can you explain that some more?
Yeah, it's Ralph McPhail, who was the road manager or roadie of Genesis in the early days and has been a long-time friend of Gabriel's. He mentions that sort of thorny relationship that Gabriel had with his mother. And sometimes, children do have those sort of rather deep and hard to unpick relationships with their parents. And it was this song, Digging in the Dirt, quite a personal song for someone who is as private and reserved as Gabriel, and quite a dramatic step to take to dig that deep into his family relationships. And not only that, but then turn it out into a song as he did. And of course, it was a single as well, Digging in the Dirt.
While it was 6 years between So and Us, it would be a full decade between Us and Peter's next studio album, 2002's Up. That peaked at number 9 in the U.S., missed the top 10 in the U.K. He started this album in 1995. What was the reason for the delay?
Well, I think I say in the book that you wait years for a Peter Gabriel album and then suddenly two come along at the same time. Well, almost at the same time. In April, we had the soundtrack to Rabbit Proof Fence, which was The Long Walk Home, a much more conventional soundtrack album than either perhaps Passion or Birdie. And then in September, we get Up. And I think the journey with the songs was for Peter Gabriel more worthwhile than the actual destination. I think you get to a point, and I think he's admitted this in interviews himself, where he could have just carried on finding these snippets of music in these world travels and adding certain layers and discovering more tunes and melodies. But ultimately, you just got to draw the line if you're a recording artist and say, this is what I've got, this is what I'm going to work with. I think the temptation for a musical explorer such as Peter Gabriel is just to keep gathering. And of course, he doesn't have a record label breathing down his neck saying you must release new content on X date. So it could be as open-ended as you like, really. And I think we're lucky we got the album when we did, to be fair.
The lead single, The Barry Williams Show, the most radio-friendly track on the album, but it failed to impact the charts like his previous singles. Here in the States, the song title was somewhat confusing. People actually thought it was a reference to the actor who played Greg Brady on the 60s sitcom The Brady Bunch. What is this song and who is the song actually about?
Yeah, well, the name Barry Williams was, according to Peter Gabriel himself, totally coincidental. I don't think he was aware of the Brady Bunch, or if he was, he hadn't registered who played Greg Brady. So just a name he picked out for a character of the song, which is a reality talk show host in the song itself. I mean, that song could easily have been called The Graeme Scarfe Show or The John Doe Show. But Barry Williams shows seem to sort of scan better, perhaps. And those early sort of popular, I suppose you'd say, they're confrontational reality shows like Jerry Springer, and they were all over the place in the 1990s. We had the Jeremy Kyle show in the UK, which is very similar. So ultimately, it's a satire of that particular part of the media at the time. And given that we've got the discussion of teenage rape and murder and things like that, I'm not surprised that as a radio-friendly single, it wasn't totally embraced. It seems to be sort of artistic suicide almost to put out a single that has things in it that are just going to flag up to the censor to say you can't play this.
His post-Up work yielded some interesting results. 2010's Scratch My Back features stripped-down versions of songs Peter was a fan of, an incredibly moving cover of David Bowie's Heroes. Talk about this song.
Certainly, his version of Heroes is, I think it does what it's one of the first ones that he'd recorded initially. And it takes a song that is so well known, and in Bowie's case, it's so brilliant, and just proves that actually, with a little bit of thought, you can actually cover an album and make it a completely new song, almost. I mean, it has got that second life now. It's on films, it's on the TV series Stranger Things, of course. And my teenage son was very interested in hearing me play it because he related it to the show, and now my daughter's just got into the show as well, and the same thing is happening.
That's great.
I'm sort of halfway hoping that it will open the door to them on Gabriel's music, but I'm not holding my breath.
It may, and that would be great. That's all it takes is that one song, and then you want to hear more of what that artist does. His 2010 album, And I'll Scratch Yours, faced some obstacles. The idea was for the artist he covered on Scratch My Back to now cover his songs, but not all of them were interested, including Radiohead.
Yeah, of all the artists that you'd expect to appreciate Gabriel's experimentation of a particular song, you wouldn't have thought that Radiohead would be the ones that objected. Certainly that stripped down song is considered too bleak even for Radiohead. and that's Street Spirit Fade Out, which is rather odd. Neil Young is another artist who never got back to Gabriel when he made the request, and that's one of the reasons why those two albums didn't come out as close together as originally intended. So perhaps it was a little bit of a misfire in the eyes of the public. These sort of two rather disparate albums with a big gap between them. But, in hindsight, you listen to them together and you can see, what he was attempting to create.
Peter's 9th studio album, 2011's New Blood, another creative adventure for Peter. He gives orchestral treatments to his songs. Is there a particular highlight from this album for you?
I think Intruder, again, actually, it really takes a visual song and gives it the full cinematic workover. One could easily see that in a Hitchcock film, for example. And you've got the string arrangement, which works in much the same way as Bernard Herrmann's score for Psycho. It's very much a star of this piece. Scraping of the bows across the strings. It just reflects that tension of calculated intrusion, and then that motif of leave his mark over the dramatic crescendo. Just really helps create that, like I said, that cinematic feel worthy of the master of suspense himself. I could listen to that song over and over and over again.
Peter Gabriel, now 71, and he's definitely earned the respect among the critics and fans. He's a Rock and Roll Hall of Famer as a solo artist and as a member of Genesis. Would you like to hear another Peter Gabriel album? And if so, what would you like to see him do next?
Well, there are those that bang on about Gabriel returning to play with Genesis, but clearly that's just sort of fanboy wish fulfillment. Although given what we've seen this week with the announcement of ABBA's virtual concert created through motion capture, the Landmarks Down on Broadway Dream ticket, I'm sure, is up for debate again. It's hard with an artist like Gabriel to sort of second guess. Almost impossible, really. We think he's going to go one way, he'll end up going in another. So if I said I think his voice would suit some traditional English folk music, then he's going to go completely in the opposite direction and release an album infused with reggae or something. I mean, he's shown through his entire career that it's all about experimentation. And if anybody's going to be able to find a tune or a melody or an instrument that nobody else has ever heard and put it into a song, it's Peter Gabriel. I hope he's out there right now trying to find that elusive new sound. Who knows, he might even be in the studio finishing up the new album as we speak. So I look forward to the next album in September, in whichever year that September is going to be.
Peter Gabriel, every album, every song. It's out now through Sonic Bond Publishing. It's available wherever books are sold and also through Sonic Bond Publishing's website, right?
No, that's right, yeah. And the online bookseller. Any
other sites you want to direct people to get a copy?
Certainly. You can get the book from Burning Shed. That's www.burningshed.com. Or there's my own website, which is www.seagullsonspeed.co.uk.
All right, and we'll put those links on the show notes page. Graeme, thanks so much. And any books that you have coming out in the future that you can tell us about?
Yeah, well, I'm just finishing up, and again, it's with Sonic Bond. It's On Track Fish, every album, every song. That's due out in the spring, and then there's two others thereafter, which I can't talk about now because I haven't finalised the contract. But yeah, there's more to come from me.
All right, looking forward to it. Hopefully we can have you back on again to talk about those books.
It'll be a pleasure to do so.
Thanks to Graeme Scarfe for taking us through his book, Peter Gabriel, Every Album, Every Song. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just the author, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore is on our show notes page. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com. On Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast. On Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. And if you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.